All right, good morning and welcome to our Erev Shabbat Parashat class, Parashat Mishpatim. Can anyone figure out the order and sequence of events of this story? And I'll tell you what I'm talking about. Parashat Mishpatim basically has two components. One is its many laws, and the second is a very fascinating but enigmatic story at the end of the parasha. Let's talk about the laws. Parashat Mishpatim is exactly what its title says it is. It is Mishpatim. It is laws of a civil society, monetary, judicial laws. It's laws, as we were just speaking amongst ourselves, that comprise many masechtot in Shas, masechtot, Baba Kama, Baba Mesiah, Baba Batra, Sanhedrin, the tractates that deal with monetary law. This parasha is the source for most of the laws of Choshen Mishpat, which, as I mentioned last year, is at least 30% of our laws of Shulchan Aruch. And therefore, this parasha is really the source of so much of Torah Sheba'al Peh and so much of Halakha. Included in it is everything from damages, thievery, negligence, laws of acquisition and of contracts, promissory notes, employees, salaries, collateral, loans, bedin proceedings, swears, laws of judges, directives to judges, laws of how they judge, how they conduct themselves. It is and it incorporates all of the law that is necessary for a civil society to function, and very appropriately, therefore, called Mishpatim. So that is the parasha in its essence and how it's known. And we're not going to go into any of the laws this morning. The second component of the parasha is a story, seemingly a continuation of a story. I'll paraphrase it, but I'll go through the Pesukim in order while paraphrasing. And if you want to follow along, in Parashat Mishpatim is Perek Kaf Dalet, chapter 24, starting from Pasuk Aleph. After this speech of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe Rabbeinu, not only laws, but at the end of the laws, he gave him certain predictions and certain instructions of entering the land of Eretz Yisrael. Afterwards, the Pasuk says, Ve'el Moshe Amar Alei Adonai. He told Moshe Rabbeinu, ascend seemingly the mountain to Hashem, to God. You, Aharon, Nadav, Abihu, Aharon's children, B'shiv'im Miziknei Yisrael, the 70 elders, and they will bow from a distance. Moshe will encroach, will come closer on his own, and they will not. And no one else from the nation will ascend the mountain at all. So Moshe, it says, came back and he told the nation all the words of Hashem. It's called Divrei Adonai, ve'et kol ha-mishpatim, remember that, and all of the quote-unquote mishpatim laws. And all of the nation, Vayan kol ha'am, we read this in Hebrew, kol ha'ad vayomeru, kol ha'devarim, asher diber Adonai na'aseh. And they said, after Moshe conveyed to them what God said, everything that God says, na'aseh, we shall do. We shall do. You can contrast that to last week's parasha, na'aseh v'nishma, but that'll come up in a moment as well. It says Moshe wrote down all the words of Hashem, and then vayashkem baboker, he gets up in the morning. He builds an altar, mizbeach, at the foot of the mountain, 12 masebah, 12 pillars that correlate with and align to the 12 Shavatim, the 12 tribes of Israel. It then says, Vayishlach na'ared b'nei Israel. He sent, the word na'ar usually means youth, and that's the Targum, Unkelu says, Bukhre, the firstborns. Some say it means the mighty, the strong ones, the prestigious ones of Bnei Israel. And they performed and offered the sacrifices. Olot, Zevahim, Shiramim, Harim. And then it says Moshe took half of the blood he put them in receptacles, and the other half he sprinkled on the altar. And then it says he took Sefer HaBerit, the book of the covenant, seemingly what he had written down just now, and perhaps from the Asir HaDeberot as well, and he read, Vayikra be'oznei ha'am, and he read it to the nation. Then they said, Kol asher deber Adonai na'aseh v'nishma. Whatever God says, we'll do and we'll accept. And then it says, Moshe, Pasuk Het, if you're following, took the Dam HaBerit, the blood of the covenant, and he sprinkled it not on the nation. The first half was sprinkled on the altar, the Mizbeach. The second half, sprinkled on the nation. And he said, this is the blood of the covenant that God made with you. Then it says, and here is where it really gets mysterious, very difficult to understand and sticky. It says, Vaya'al Moshe Aharon Nadav Abihu, Moshe Aharon, his children, and the 70 elders ascended. And then it says, Pasuk Yud and Yud Aleph are the most difficult Pesukim in the entire Torah, Yud Bet. It says, Vayir'u et Elohei Yisrael. Literally, they saw the God of Israel. V'tahat raglav k'ma'aseh libnat hasapir u'esem hashamayim latohar. Literally, and under his feet, k'viyachol, it was like a working of libnat hasapir, sapphire brickwork, u'esem hashamayim latohar, like the essence and the purity of heaven. Very difficult even to say those words literally. And then Pasuk Yud, those two Pesukim, he didn't send his hand or smite perhaps or hurt the strong ones of Bnei Israel. They saw God, and they had a Sabbath. They ate and they drank. What is going on here is a completely another subject for another time. But Azat Hashem, maybe next year's class in this venue will speak about this episode. And then, of course, Hashem told Moshe, now go up to the mountain, and I'm going to give you the luchot, the tablets. And Moshe and Yeshua part of the way followed him, told the Zekirim, the elders, you guys stay here. Aaron and Hur are in charge. Approached them if there's any problems. Moshe went up to the mountain. Vaychase Anan, the cloud covered the mountain. It says Moshe was dwelling on Har Sinai as the cloud covered him for 6 days. On the seventh day, Hashem said, Yallah, time to go. The vision of God was like a devouring fire, Berosh Ahad, at the head of the mountain. Moshe then came in the cloud, ascended the rest of the mountain, and he was there for 40 days and 40 nights. Okay. It's a dramatic scene. As we said, it's mysterious, it's enigmatic, it's difficult to understand. It's exciting. And it's stated after all of these laws. So it needs to be said that there is a very clean mahloket, a clear argument as to when this episode occurred. It's really based on the Midrash Mechilta, and you can say that Rashi and Ramban very much go at it, as of the Mefarshim, the commentators on the parasha, amongst others who take each side, and are in two positions of the Midrash Mechilta. And that is that Rashi says that this entire parasha is not in order necessarily, and that the story that we just read you at the end really occurred before Ve'ele HaMishpatim. Meaning, according to Rashi, what's the sequence of events? Last week was the Aseret HaDeberot. We call Matan Torah, Parashat Yitro. And we saw all the lead up, the dramatic lead up to the Matan Torah. This story at the end occurred before Aseret HaDeberot was spoken, before the Ten Commandments. Then Ve'ele HaMishpatim. Hashem continued to tell Moshe Rabbeinu about these Mishpatim, these particular laws of our parasha, and then he went up to Har Sinai for the rest, for the 40 days. The Ramban vehemently argues, it pays to read the Ramban Hebrew and English, just to go through and understand his arguments, his proofs, his disproofs to Rashi, etc. But he says everything here is in complete order. In other words, last week, Matan Torah Aser HaDiberot in Parashat Yitro, with all of the extra fascinating extracurricular and metaphysical lead up to the Matan Torah event. Then Hashem relayed to Moshe Rabbeinu ve'ela hamishpatim, all the laws of this parasha. Then the scene that we just read occurred, and the berit and the covenant, the blood of the covenant was made. The fascinating vision that they saw, whatever they saw, and then he went up to Har Sinai. So this is a big, it's very significant dispute among the scholars as to whether component number one was before component number two in this parasha, and it's in order, chronologically speaking, or component number two came first and it's not in chronological order. However, either way that you look at this, what's definitely true about the text is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided that Ele HaMishpatim, the list of laws of this parasha, the civil laws, the laws, the monetary laws, belong written in the text prior to the continuation of the dramatic story, a dramatic scene of Har Sinai and all the special effects, or it's another scene of special effects in Har Sinai. But definitely Hashem chose to write it first. And the question is as follows, and Rabbi Soloveitchik asked this question, and I'll elaborate it on a bit. Why? Why? Obviously, according to the opinion that it's out of order, it's hard to understand why it should be out of order written in the text. Wouldn't you think that that incredibly dramatic, significant, historic scene, which happened once in human history, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would want us to see that scene in totality as one scene without interruption? But I'll go further and say, even according to the one that holds, that's Ramban, based on one opinion of Hachamim, that this is all in order. And Ele HaMishpatim, the laws were conveyed first of this parasha, and then there was a second, the dramatic scene of Har Sinai. With all that, Moshe hasn't taught the Mishpatim to the people yet. And even if he did, we don't really know the order of teaching of the entire Torah to Bnei Israel. Couldn't Hashem wait to write down these laws afterwards and make these two scenes contiguous to each other? After all, even if Hashem told the Mishpatim in the middle of the two scenes, they're really one big scene. It happened at most the next morning, a day apart, within 24 hours. Why in the world would HaKadosh Baruch Hu want in the Torah to break up the most dramatic and significant scene of all time with a set of laws, with the Mishpatim? Why would this event be abruptly interrupted in this parasha, and of all things, with monetary laws, with civil laws, with what an outsider would say the more bland laws of the Torah, of everything? Now, there's a famous Rashi that starts the parasha that notices, based on the Hachamim, the letter Vav, ve'el hamishpatim, and these are the ordinances, these are the laws, and that means that Vav points to Rashi out and connects to the previous to tell us that just like last week's dramatic Aser HaDiberot, the so-called 10 Commandments, were from Har Sinai, so too these Mishpatim. You may not think that these are authentically given on Har Sinai. Maybe it was a lecture from Moshe Rabbeinu based on what he understood. No, these are just as much emanating from Har Sinai as the Aser HaDiberot. So that really addresses the connection between the Mishpatim and Parashat Yitro, but not necessarily the placement in the text. Why does Mishpatim interrupt in the middle of the grand scene of Mount Sinai? So I'm going to give you two different approaches to try to reconcile this difficulty. First, the Sefat Emet. The Sefat Emet is possibly based on the Midrash as well. Is a pasuk that we read every morning in Tehillim at the end of the second Mizmor Hallelujah. Magid devarav leYaakov, tukav u'mishpatav leYisrael. Lo asa chen lechokoy umishpaltim bal yedeum. Hallelujah. Last two pesukim of that Mizmor. Magid debarav liYisrael. Hashem speaks, he conveys his devarav. Sefat Emet says based on Hakamim, that aligns to the diburim, aser hadeberot, and then hukav umishpatav liYisrael, and only then the mishpatim. Meaning, he says, it would have been impossible for Bnei Israel to accept hukav umishpatav, which includes the mishpatim of our parasha, until they first received aser hadeberot. So this connection is deeper than we thought. Based on the pasuk, the Sefat Emet is explaining to us, is that the Torah, Hashem, in recording the text this way, tells us that these mishpatim that seem so simple and straightforward and so obvious and so logical, because you need a civil society, would have been impossible. Oh, legal scholar, let's solicit and pick the brain of a lawyer. Let's get some constitutional expert over here. No, sir. It's impossible to accept and understand these mishpatim without the aseret hadeberot seen and knowledge first. Let me elaborate more on that and try to explain. A moral and civil code of society to function as a civil society, relatively speaking, the United States of America is and maybe the most civil society in history besides the society of Am Yisrael. But its laws are purely subjective. In other words, who's saying what's legal? Who's deciding what components, what laws, what principles go into a civil society? What's morality? It's moral behavior in terms of the interaction between one person and the next. It's really purely subjective. It's based on place and time. We can see in our very day, in our generation, United States of America, that the value system is starting to change. Let's not go into the politics at all, but it's very different, obviously, in the value system and the ways that we look at law even a generation ago, but certainly 100 to 200 years ago. There's no question about that. There is only one absolute truth. Everything on earth is subjective from the perspective of human beings. There's one single absolute truth. That's the truth of God. That's the truth of Hashem, and by extension, the intellect of God, which is HaTorah HaKadoshah. And therefore, you have to have first experience the divine revelation on Har Sinai, subjugating yourself, ourselves, to God, the Torah and its laws, its perfection and its absolute nature. And then, and only then, you could accept Mishpatim. Because then you know that these very civil laws, these monetary laws, these judicial laws are divine laws. They're perfect laws. Those are the only perfect way to guide and structure a civil society. Those only. Accept its source, experience Har Sinai, hear Aseret HaDeberot, and then I'll tell you about the Mishpatim. Because then you know what it means to subjugate yourself to a God and perform laws, not because you think they make sense, not because that they seem to be logical in terms of structuring a society, but because God said so. And people often get confused and mixed up between moral and legal, right? Hey, I'm doing the moral thing. It's legal. It's all in the up and up. That's not always true. Very often we could be doing something that's legal in the eyes of the most civil society in human history, United States of America, and it still could be immoral in the eyes of the Torah and Hashem. By the way, vice versa. It's very possible for something to be to be completely illegal in American society, and I'm not, God forbid, advocating or suggesting to engage in illegal activity, because we're bound to dinah d'malchuta, the laws of the land, but it's possible for something to be illegal in your land, in this land, and be very moral and ethical in the eyes of Torah. So those two don't always align, because the vision and perspective of subjective society, as close to moral as it may be, is nowhere in comparison to the absolute and perfect truth of the laws and the Mishpatim of Torah. That's one important principle and way to reconcile the fact that God wanted to record Ve'ele HaMishpatim, these ordinances, these monetary and civil laws, immediately after the scene of the Asir HaDeberot on Mount Sinai. Second of all, this is based on an essay of Rabbi Soloveitchik. Rabbi Soloveitchik says that without these Mishpatim, there can be no Mamlechet Kohanim Ve'goy Kadosh. The invitation to Har Sinai and the Asir HaDeberot, Hashem says, if you accept, if you say I do, you'll become a nation of priests, of servants of God, and a Goy Kadosh, a sanctified nation. Kiddusha, sanctity, serving and observing God is impossible without these Mishpatim. Meaning, he says that the Mishpatim lay the entire framework of a civil society, of civil relationships, of human behavior. But the civil law of Torah carries what he calls religious significance. Civil law is religious law. And people get that the word religious is not even a great and accurate word to describe someone. Observance is a much better law. But people confuse and sometimes frame and use the parameters of defining who's religious as with the rituals he performs, tefillin, minyan, the holidays, Shabbat, all holy, all incredibly incumbent upon us, but not necessarily business interactions. Those aren't holy. Those are good. You're a good guy. That's not what makes you religious. Says Rabbi Soloveitchik that the civil laws that are laid out to us in our parasha, the monetary laws, the laws dealing with money and judicial system, are religious laws. They are religious, they're holiness, they're kiddusha. To be a goy kadosh, to be a sanctified nation, you need to embrace laws like this. They have religious significance in and of themselves. And things like destruction of property, trespassing, violating a loan or a promissory note, they're not just merely violations of civil law. They're violations, they're moral transgressions. They are moral transgressions. They are immoral. And that's why we're told by the Hachamim, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, after 120, will ask us before to keep Shabbat, to keep Kashrut, etc. Nasata v'natata be'umrat. Did you lead a life of honesty and integrity? Number one, that is religion. That is observance of God. That is sanctity. That is holiness. How HaKadosh Baruch Hu framed what a civil society is and instructed and charged us as individuals with conducting ourselves, and that's a civil society, including all monetary laws, all laws of finances, all laws of interactions with people. That is the way we infuse Kedusha in our regular, mundane, everyday lives. When we pick up and go to work, when we interact with people in a store, in a bank, or on the phone, or anywhere else. That is part and parcel of what it means to be a sanctified Jewish nation and a Jewish servant of God. That's critical to understand because we know that later on in history, the prophets excoriated the people for corruption and lack of honesty, integrity, and used that as a big reason for destruction. And Yeshaya Hanavi said, "Sion b'mishpat tipadeh." You want redemption of Yerushalayim, it's got to be with law and order. It has to be with civil law, with mishpat, with mishpatim. You have to understand that that is just as critical as the rituals to God. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said right after Matan Torah, right after Aseh Deberot, I am stating right here and now, Ve'ele, with the Vav, the connecting Vav, and these are the Mishpatim. And we are told at the end of that Mizmor, after Magid Rav Yaakov Hukam Mishpatav Yisrael, Lo Asachem Lecho Goy. HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not offer any nation on earth the ability to lead themselves in such an ethical way with the regular civil transactions between man and fellow man. Mishpatim bal yeda'on. He didn't offer them the distinction and the fortune of having these mishpatim, this absolute code of functioning as holy people in a society. It's in our everyday experiences, it's in our interactions, and it's way more than what we normally consider to be religious and observant people. It is every step we take and every word that we say in the functioning of the mishpatim of our very day, and thus the holiness of these laws and their placement in the parasha. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen. Shabbat shalom.